All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for folks who are on the West Coast or not on the East Coast with us. But it's my pleasure to join you all today with Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who is an old friend of Equity in the Center, going back to our earliest days when we published the
Mhm.
resources or published our Awake to Woke to Work Building a Race Equity Culture research and hosted
Mhm.
summits, bringing together folks from philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and race equity practitioners and consultants to talk about how to transform organizational culture to center equity. And I was introduced to Dr. Manuel's work in a previous role prior to Equity in the Center, where we were talking about telling stories and making the case for investment in what some people might call historically underserved or historically marginalized communities. And what are the stories that we tell one another as folks who are members of and supporters of those communities? What are the stories we tell ourselves and tell folks we want to invest in our communities about why we're trying to achieve certain outcomes? And so I learned from Dr. Manuel how best to frame a conversation that is as inclusive as possible of folks who may not traditionally see themselves as aligned to supporting our communities. Because I guess counterintuitively, we often make the case for our work using
Mhm.
stories and language that align to the systems of marginalization that got us where we are.
That's right.
So it's a pleasure to have you here today. It's been a while since we reconnected. And we're going to talk about strategic case making in this particularly challenging moment for equity, but really for civil rights in this country. So I want to give you a
Mhm.
moment to introduce yourself and your two books, The Case Made and Fast Track, before we dive into talking about how strategic case making can support folks in keeping on in this moment, and aligning more folks to support the work of equity as it's challenged at the national and state level. So I'll toss it to you to talk a bit about your work.
Absolutely. Well, welcome everybody to this LinkedIn Live. I'm Dr. Tiffany Manuel. Everybody just calls me Dr. T. For those of you who know my work, you know that I am, to Kay's point, for a long time, been trying to help people make a stronger case for justice-focused work. What does it look like to position justice as a goal that everybody sees themselves in, not just people who feel like they have been marginalized or have been marginalized historically? And that takes some real strategy and skills, especially in a very complex, let's just call it a complex political, social, economic, and cultural environment in which we live. And this moment, I think, is stretching most of us who do justice focused works into, I would say, master class level skills relative to how we build that strong, enduring case, not just for equity, but just as a general principle that we all are human beings that are imbued just by the very nature of being human with a set of faculties and with a set of rights that should be afforded to us just because we are on the planet, right? And so I'm excited to be here with you because I think the conversation we're about to have is really powerful. So I'll talk about strategic case making as we go along and provide examples from my books. But I'm just really excited to have Kay the conversation with you and for all those folks who are like you and I, in it for the long term. We're not in it because it's the moment and it's fashionable or not. We're in it because we believe at
Mm-hmm.
the very core of who we are that there is a just future that we're getting after. So thank you for the
Yeah.
invitation.
No, thanks for joining us. And thank you for saying that, yes, we all deserve these things just by virtue of our birth and existence, which,
Hmm.
surprisingly, not everyone feels that that's the case for folks of every community.
That's right.
But you're here, and so you deserve a certain set of rights and access that has
Hmm.
historically been hoarded. So maybe
Hmm.
we can start by just talking about what is strategic case making, and
Hmm.
in this moment of heightened tension and backlash, how can leaders leverage it as a strategy to strengthen, well, narrative is a lot of what folks have been talking about, I'd say, for
Hmm.
the past year or so,
Hmm.
and efforts to engage stakeholders in supporting the work of justice
Hmm.
um, in our communities.
Absolutely. So let's talk about it. So I would say strategic case making is, I would say, the next part of the evolution that many of us are making in the sort of language, messaging, framing, narrative space. I think many, many moons ago, I think many of us started with just kind of the idea that if you could frame the conversation around some of these tough issues, right, that you could get a different outcome. And I was one of the folks who was very invested in the idea of doing all these framing studies. If you could test it out on big, large populations with a randomized control, like who could you pull forward just by tweaking a little bit of the way that you talk about this, right? And many of us got into the early phases. You might even remember, just say these words, but not these words, and things, right? These kind of phrases here and there, because there really are some frame effects that happen when you just swap out a couple words. I think that was the beginning of the large beginning, I think, of what has become a wider tale of a field. Then I think a lot of folks move to messaging, which is if you can figure out how to rig some of these words, can you put that into messaging around social issues that could demonstrate some real power in terms of pulling a couple more people forward? That resulted in a lot of polling studies. If you could, craft the messaging just right, you could get that. Then I think the field moved to a set of conversations around narrative. Can you tell complete stories that get our identity issues involved? Can you tell complete stories or larger stories that were big enough to get more people inside of it and bring even more people forward? And so I think the field of narrative as a field has grown. And I think the next stop on the way to continue to expand, right, building broader public will is strategic case making. How do you use what you know from framing, from the kind of messaging data and science, all the way out to narrative strategy, to actually use all that to make the case for the affirmative thing that you want to do, not against something else, not not in denial of something else, not in just having people talk about it, but what can we do? Are you willing to move people to a level of activation around things that are really meaningful? And that requires yet another set of skill set that I think we're putting on top of that. So for those who are interested in this, I wrote a book talking about the principles of strategic case making that incorporates a sort of framing and narrative and messaging strategies. But it's really, I would say, the next version of what, for us, how we move people in this direction, and a set of principles and skill sets that help you do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I took for granted when introducing you that everything I learned from you was science-based, which is really important today. So thank you for naming all the research that has gone into over a couple of decades. Your approach, because that's the thing that really resonated for me initially, is that the science does not support our sort of natural human attempts to bring people along. They're opposed completely.
That's right. That's right.
So you have to reset and move away from language that is, like we might say now, I don't think this is the word that was used when you and I first connected, but triggering. So if I trigger you, then you just stop listening by using a certain word, you just stop listening to anything that I'm saying. So in the present, in this moment, how would you suggest the folks who are listening, some of whom may be in organizations, some may be in movement or community spaces, how do you make a forward-looking case for equity that helps folks who may not traditionally have been part of their stakeholder group feel invested and included in the goal toward which we're working, whether it's equity or justice or safe communities? What advice would you give in navigating this moment?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say that is such an important question. And I think just related to the conversation about this is a science, and don't just do this because Dr. T said so or because I think so. There is a science of this, right? Things that we know that that are measurable in terms of the impact on the other side. So the things that I'm talking about come out of the social sciences. So I'm a social scientist, and I listen very carefully, but also test out some of the strategies that we're talking about. And a lot of what I'm talking about just comes out of I would say, behavioral and cultural sciences, because the way that we get people to respond or the way that people make decisions is usually not because they got all the data and evidence, right? I always tell people, like, if we were thinking about policymaking as an exercise in data and evidence, the United States would look very different. Like 99% of the stuff that we're doing right now has absolutely no evidence base for what it means for us to be thriving, healthy human beings, what it means for cost effectiveness. We're doing all kind of stuff. and making decisions nationally and even at some levels of local and state level decision making based on things like identity and culture and issues of the energy of how people feel and the sense of how they feel connected to a we or not. And so once you understand that, you're like, wait. I can have all the data and evidence about why equity is actually the smarter strategy. It is the way, right, to get to a more prosperous, healthy, happy society where people feel a sense of belonging and inclusion. But the data and evidence itself doesn't speak for itself. If folks are operating on the level of culture, who I feel connected to, who I feel belongs, who deserves, that requires a different set of strategies. And so in this moment, your question was very specific. How do we then talk about equity if it's not the decades of data that we have that would support an equity focused approach in almost every aspect of right, social issues, right? So one of the things I would say is, and you named it, we have to have a very forward looking case, and a part of the conversation is changing the nature of the questions that we're asking people to solve for, right? We're not solving for equity just because it's the fair or just or even smart choice. We've already established that, right? It's not that. But think about what becomes possible when you ask people, right, whoever that is, whether they feel connected to equity or not, what becomes possible for you when everybody can fully participate, contribute, and thrive in this community? What, like, not what happens for them, not what happens right over there for businesses or for folks in that community. No, what happens for you? What becomes possible for you when everybody gets a shot at something here, when everybody's kind of in it? And when you ask people that question and they start to talk about, yeah, well, actually, here's what I feel. The world that I want to live in is where I don't have to be afraid to walk down the street because people who don't have resources or don't have access or don't have options, right, are challenging my ability to live freely in the world that, right, I'd like to live in. Or that when what becomes possible for me when I feel like everybody has a shot, people participate in our community differently, right? So when you ask that kind of question, that's a forward-looking conversation about the equity story we want to tell, that so many things are possible, folks. And when you can get people into the excitement of what equity means, right, that is a different kind of conversation. Equity is not a punishment, right? Equity is not a consequence for things that we didn't do quite in the past. Equity is not a compromise that we all have to make against our better judgments, and that's the way that sometimes it's framed. And so when people feel like it's equity is something that's put on them, they reject it, right? They not only reject it, but they lean out of it. Think about, like, in COVID when we asked people to wear masks. Once people figured out, we can talk about this too, but once people figured out that the folks who were dying from COVID, or who were not, who were having adverse outcomes relative to COVID, and once they figured out that it was probably more the folks who were marginalized, but it wasn't necessarily everybody, the masks start flying off. People didn't want to do it. Da, 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 da. So that conversation about what is it for me that happened? What becomes possible even for me and everybody around me when equity is at the center, right? That's a very different conversation. And as we start to tell that story, it opens more people up to what we're talking about. And so the thing I want to just make sure we get into this conversation is, we in this space have spent decades building up the formal case, like the business case for equity, the moral case for equity, just the aspirational case. We have all that in spades. You don't need to do any more studies. You don't need to,
No, we don't.
Literally. Like,
somebody is out there though
research, have at it, but we don't need it.
About to fund a study, but
oh,
no,
please don't. Please, we got that. We got that. That's not the way that folks are making their decisions about whether they support equity focused work. And once you get that and you're like, okay, now you can tell a different sort of, I would say, larger story anyway.
Oh, thank you. That's so helpful. And the nuance of the question you suggest asking, what's in it for you? So how would your life be different? Or how would your family life or the possibilities for your children be different? From the time when we published the paper to now, like, Equity in the Center has always been really clear about the fact that we want folks to disaggregate the data, because the answer, the case for equity, so to speak, is in the data, but it's also in the science, and we know that folks don't necessarily respond to that. But in the past year or so, as folks have asked, so how can we persist with our work? We have encouraged folks to disaggregate the data, let's say on maternal and infant mortality in a particular zip code in their community, if they're a community foundation, and then put the significant disparities on the slide, and then have a conversation about how they feel about not doing anything about the numbers in this zip code versus in the adjacent zip code. And we have found that folks respond to that because it gives them a clearer sense of not of what's in it for them or for their neighbor, or what the day-to-day life and death implications of a lack of equity are. And that can sometimes be an entry point into the conversation. But beyond that, we'll often encourage folks to think about, when it comes to equity, what is in it for you? So are you a veteran? Do you have a veteran in your family? Do your children have IEPs? Are there folks in your family who benefit from the ADA? It's not just, Black and brown folks or women, though some people are more comfortable with the idea of women having access to things than Black and brown folks. But I encourage folks to go through all of the sort of identities that may not often be named, like disability or veteran status or older Americans, because everyone has a what's in it for me in there somewhere. And you're okay with the programs and the initiatives and the policies that are designed to address those inequities, because you don't think of them as inequities. You think of them as things that you deserve.
That's right.
Someone who was in the service, or an older American, and like trying to expand that deservedness to include more folks. So I hope folks will adopt your strategy and think more strategically about how they can expand people's concept of the we by starting with themselves.
Absolutely. And I love how you talked about that in terms of, so two things I would say, two things that come out of that. One, that it's great to be able to disaggregate that data at the local level so that people can see in our community, here's the impact of not having an equity focused approach. And I would just encourage people, and I have a whole chapter in this in the Case Made book on just the data, because so many of us are taking data and putting it out there as negatively valent data, which only sort of reinforces and demoralizes the conversation. You want to take that data and flip it over. What is the opportunity of solving that in this community? So we may know that, let's just say in terms of, mothers who maternal health outcomes, and we know that there's some disparities relative to that in a particular community. Don't put that out as this many moms in this community have had, adverse negative maternal issues relative to their pregnancies, because we haven't adopted the kind of policies that would help them. Flip it over and say, you know what I'm excited about? I'm excited about the fact that we now know enough to figure out like what it takes to make sure that every mom in this community has what they need to have the most beautiful baby in the world, because every mom thinks that their baby is the most beautiful baby in the world. And here's what it takes to get there. We're already solving for this many moms. Here's the challenge though. And that's an opportunity for, what if we were to figure out how to make sure every single mom in this community has what she needs? Here are the strategies that help us do that. Having doulas available to every mom, making sure that every mom has access to affordable healthcare, making sure that every mom has whatever it is in that particular community. So turn it over as an opportunity to make sure that everybody has what we all aspire to. And the reason you want to do that is because you want to make the conversation aspirational. You want to have it asset based, and you want to get people excited, right? There's so much just negative stuff. I mean, think about this. And Kate, you and I talked about this many, many moons ago. But every single story on the news is so disastrously negative. It's awful. And then if you go on social media, like the sort of doom scrolling is unbelievable, right? So our opportunity is to turn that over. What does it look like to get people just ruthlessly excited about something good, even though what we're talking about are some really heavy issues? So if folks want to check that out, that's a great opportunity to be able to do that. Turn that data over. And in the book, I give I think the longest chapter in my book is on data, because so many of us are taking the sort of disparity data and then pushing that out And it just reinforces the idea that there's a
The
whole lot of stuff that's
negativity.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that communities, people can then misinterpret the data as like the communities are responsible for
Exactly.
that. And it, well,
Exactly.
we all know the story about for maternal and infant mortality. So like we are unhealthy and don't exercise and don't make good choices. And so how you frame the opportunity to support these
Absolutely.
two adjacent communities is important, because you can either build on or push back on the implicit bias about why the data looks the way that it is.
That's
And
right.
I have seen folks get really excited about graduation rates, for example, because who doesn't get
Mm-hmm.
excited about the idea, like, oh, every kid in this
Mm-hmm.
community can
Mm-hmm.
graduate from high school? Like, how, who wouldn't say that that's a good thing for a child to
That's right.
graduate from high school, like,
That's right.
regardless of your belief about where folks belong in society?
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to argue against that. So I hear what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying about making sure that it's positively framed as an opportunity, and that we are really intentional about not building on
Mm-hmm.
stereotypes about why communities are marginalized, because they have been historically and structurally marginalized. And I know that I can often see that happen in board meetings, where people will
Mm-hmm.
make comments on like poor kids,
Mm-hmm.
in quote, and
Mm-hmm.
poor
Mm-hmm.
communities. So those recommendations are much needed. So related to that, my question would be for leaders. So in boardrooms and organizations, what leadership practices do you think need to be heightened or brought to the forefront at this point to
Mm-hmm.
shift from this reactive messaging to more proactive, strategic case making
Mm-hmm.
on a consistent basis? Because one thing I always heard you say, going back to when we first met, is that it's not just the things that you say in your blog or in your public communications, it's in the language that you use every day in your organization, with your team, with your board. So how can leaders make that pivot? I know you have some thoughts on how we
Oh,
pivot.
absolutely. I love that. So absolutely. I think so. First of all, thank you for grounding this in a conversation about leadership, because I think that's where this belongs. This conversation about equity is really a fundamental question about leadership. I think you're right. When I would say coming out of the pandemic and the sort of conversation about George Floyd, everybody who was a leader was making statements about all kind of things. Some of the stuff you can tell they didn't really even believe in, but because that was the issue du jour, or set of issues du jour, commitments were flying left and right. Oh, we're going to do this, and then as soon as the boat got a little rocky, right? As soon as the sort of political dimensions of let's say our governance system changed because of some right. As soon as
Mm-hmm.
that changed and the boat got a little rocky, folks were flying off the boat faster than you could even count. Like, wait, what happened to the commitment to, right? So, I just like to just remind folks that this is about leadership. Where are your leaders? When things are rocky, that's when you really find out like who's really rocking for you and who's really not. And so now the good news about the moment that we're in is that we're really clear, right? Because the folks who jumped ship, it was very clear. This really wasn't about equity. It was about leaning into the moment and saying some things that were just right in keeping with where you thought the crowd was moving. So for those folks who are still in the boat, the folks who really understand like that this is the pathway to the next vision of what this country becomes. We can get there faster, we can get there slow, we can get there painfully, or we can get there joyfully. Whatever it is, however you want to go, we're
Yeah.
getting there. Right, for that it is about being adaptive in this moment. So how do you pivot from telling this sort of old story about equity and trying to I would say from defending equity. We've done so much to try to defend equity, and I would say defending equity right now, full stop, is a losing strategy. It keeps us locked in somebody else's frame about whether or not it's just and fair and da da da. Stop. Adaptive leaders understand that that's not where we are right now. Adaptive leadership says we need a different story that builds a different version of us and we, the folks who are in the boat, and to pilot that boat very strategically and carefully. In my second book, in Fast Track, I have a whole chapter on adaptive leadership about how you take the moment that you're in, like a tennis ball, right? And anybody who plays, I'm a tennis player. So anybody who knows when you play tennis, the best possible place to hit that ball is when the ball bounces and it's in the air and it's about to come back down. When you get that ball right there, that is the best place to take that ball and get it back about over the net. And I would say we are in that moment. The ball is bounced, it's in our
Mm-hmm.
court. The opportunity is to pivot to a very different kind of story that reframes and redirects so that you're not defending stuff. You're not trying to defend against some crazy statement some leader has made, who shall remain nameless, many of them who shall, like, not responding to that, but to take whatever it is that's happening either within your community or in the larger cultural conversation and reshape it to fit the conversation we need to have, which is how do we build solidarity around something that is aspirational for all of us? What's the possibility for all of us, right, of leaning in this way? So one of the things that I share in the book and in the Case Made book is a strategy around how you pivot, how you take that ball in the air. Oh, okay, you want you if that's what it is for you, you want to talk about that. Absolutely, perfectly willing to have that conversation. Here's why this is important to the way that we all get to the next place of who we need to become, and send it right back over the net. And to be deliberate and strategic in how that happens. And so all that to say, I think the grounding of this in leadership, the notion that the old story that we're telling is probably not the best one. Was it right? We've done it. We've gone as far as we can go with the sort of old version of that. The new version of this has to land in a place that is aspirational, that builds on the sense of who we are and who we all can become, get right, given what this looks like. And then to be very, very clear about the sort of call to action in that space. That's kind of the case making version of that. What's the call to action? How do and I would say, and this may rub some people the wrong way. I don't know. We'll see. But I don't really care what you call it. I think, right, people are doing some fantastic equity focused work. I don't care if you call it blue ice cream on Sunday. Get the work done, people. I like, so in other words, I'm saying let us not get stuck in the semantics of, is it this? Is it that? Should we call it this? Should we get it that? Use this word or that word? Get the work done. And I think when you and I have talked about this before, I think we both understand that most folks actually really don't even understand what the word equity means. So we can redefine it any way we want to, but also don't get stuck in that. If somebody says, I don't want to support your work, or I'm not leaning into equity, so move that right to the side and say, well, this is the work we're doing. What becomes possible for all of us when everybody can participate? And you can give some examples of that. Let people chew on that a little bit. And what'll happen is they will come to the same conclusion that you already have, which is equity is the way forward. And again, listen, I don't care what you call it. You can, I don't care. And I know that may rub some people the wrong way because they want to definitively name it and like, listen, hey, have at it. I just care that the work gets done, right?
No, I agree with you. And I think in the past year, when I've facilitated sessions, folks are surprised when I say that. So ultimately, obviously, I believe in equity since that's my day job. And in this season, we need to get the work done. And I'll often share examples of folks in states like Texas or Florida who, despite significant challenges that predated the current administration, have been able to continue the work by calling it what they need to call it. And calling it what you need to call it doesn't have to fly in the face of your values. I think it depends on your local context and, as you said, the leadership of your organization. But there are a good number of people who have been able to keep doing what they have been doing since 2020 or before by changing the language. So removing some things from websites, but the programs remain. And I understand the very strong feelings and the backlash or the boycotts that have resulted from actions such as those. And depending upon the organization in which you operate, if you're a community-based organization versus a foundation versus kind of like an intermediary-like organization, which EIC is, the urgency of persisting in your work varies. So if you need to get resources to folks who might be under attack by ICE or basically community level issues that are urgent and day-to-day and life and death, then you need to do what you need to do to move the resources. And I don't see that as a compromise of your values because you're still doing the work. And I think folks can be challenged by what you're saying. But going quiet on some things while the work persists, I don't see that as a loss or a failure if your work continues and then exists on the other side.
That's right. That's right. And for some of us, it may mean that we need to actually rethink our work. So this is, I would say this moment is an opportunity to even rethink how that work gets done and who we're calling into the conversation. Because I think that for many of our organizations, the call to the willing has been too slight to bring forward the wider range of folks who need to be not just in the conversation, but who need to be doing the work. So this is an
Mhm.
opportunity to say, hey, wait a minute, okay, we might have to change the language, but if we change the language, can we actually call more people into this conversation to get the work done? And if the answer is yes, then I think you need to do that, because I think it would be negligence if you don't. If you know that calling more people in could actually affect more people and improve the lives of more people, listen, you got to do that. And if the word is changed from this to that, it could, blue ice cream on Sunday, we're offering it, and it actually helps more people, right? Especially folks who are marginalized and suffering under this particular set of issues that are happening. Listen, folks, go out there and get that for folks. I don't know if that for me, I feel like I have the luxury, right, to hold people to a litmus test of language that doesn't actually result in the things that my community needs. I'm not going to do it. Every day of the week, I'm going to make the choice to make sure that people get what they need for food, for shelter, for dignity, for self-respect, for jobs, etc.
Mhm.
And I think so I think the perspective that we're sharing is really about how not to be defensive in a moment that almost calls for it. Like, listen, I'm not leaning into the energy of defense. That's not what I'm doing. I'm leaning into the energy of possibility. And what does it look like for us to open up opportunities, especially for people who haven't had those opportunities? And I'm doing that under significant constraint. That is true, but what opportunities does doing it under constraint even offer me in the community? And if people are in the energy of that, you lean into the energy of that, you get a very different set of outcomes, in part because it forces you to use your own creative faculties to open up some possibilities that you might not even have had to do because we were locked into a very specific definition of how we were operating. So
Yeah.
if there's opportunity for that, hey, let's do it, folks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as you were talking, regardless of how you frame it or the language that you use, the case is still essentially the same. As you were
Mhm,
saying, like, so the case has been made, the data is decades or centuries
mhm,
old, depending upon what
mhm,
you're looking at. So the
mhm,
why is
mhm,
consistent, but
mhm,
you're changing your language to help people feel more a part of the same thing. And I've heard some
mhm,
people say when they
mhm,
heard from a donor, like, okay, well, I'm not doing DEI anymore. It's like, this is still a
mhm,
scholarship
mhm,
program. So the
mhm,
reason you would give a scholarship today is the same reason that you would have given a scholarship like 5 years
mhm,
ago, so that these
mhm,
individuals can complete college or complete high school.
mhm,
And
mhm.
grounding folks in the possibility to which they're still connected, regardless of the rhetoric that's flying around
That's right.
in the broader landscape. Thank you so much. I know we're at time. Are there any
Mhm,
closing words you would leave folks with? I know sometimes we encourage people to make tiny changes on a daily basis, and I think
mhm.
you've given folks lots of examples, but is there anything else you would leave folks with to try or consider or to reframe in
Yeah,
their daily work?
yeah. I think that the three things I want to leave people with, it's I want to leave three. One, just the notion that we need to shift the story that we're telling about equity, so that we widen the number of folks who are invited to this conversation. Two, this is a leadership conversation. This is not just like this is an interesting thing to do, or you should, and all of us are leaders. It doesn't matter what title you have, top of the organization, bottom of the organization, somewhere in the middle management, doesn't matter. All of us are leaders pulling with the ability to pull people forward into a conversation that's bigger than we are. And the third thing is really around your case making. Like, it's not just enough to frame the issues, generally speaking. It's not just enough to have some general messaging or a few narrative like sound bites or slogans. You actually have to gain the skills of what it looks like to make a stronger case that pulls people into the energy, right, of the story that you're telling alongside the data that you have and the strategy that you are operating under. So if folks are willing to lean into that, changing the story of possibility, thinking strategically about your own leadership and making that leadership as adaptive as possible, and then finally getting the skills that you need to actually make the case for the affirmative world that we want to live in, right? You're doing
Mhm.
those three things, my God, then we are going to change the world.
Oh, absolutely. And you can change, as you were saying, you can lead at every level. I feel like I talk to a lot of folks who don't have the support of their leadership anymore.
Hmm, hmm,
So, at whatever level of an organization you operate, folks can use the tactics and the strategies that you're naming to bring other people along. And then hopefully that would then be able to cascade to the work outside of the organization. So I would encourage folks to consider how they can use the strategies Dr. T is outlining in bringing their supervisors, their CEO, their board members along, so that leaders feel that this is a body of work that's worth the continued investment. Because I know that's the space in which a lot of folks who are listening and folks that we work with are positioned now. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It was fun to hang out again, and we will have to do this again.
Let's do it. Let's do it. All right, folks. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.